This watch is a $30 Casio. My last one was a Patek Philippe I lost in a bet, along with $10 million, all in one night. But the truth is, I had lost myself long before that final hand was dealt. For a decade, I was the man who couldn't lose, a ghost in the machine of chance pulling levers the casinos never wanted you to see. This is the story of the night that proved me wrong and the lesson that cost me everything to learn. My name is Arthur Vance and I'm 62 years old. The story I'm about to tell you isn't one of luck. Luck is for tourists and fools. Mine was a story of numbers, of absolute certainty in a world built on seductive chaos. It begins, as most tales of ruin do, with a quiet promise of escape. 34 years ago, I was a 28-year-old certified public accountant. My world was a symphony of beige. Beige cubicle walls, beige computer monitors, beige folders filled with other people's beige financial lives. I spent 10 hours a day, 5 days a week, under the sickly hum of fluorescent lights, reconciling accounts and minimizing tax liabilities for a mid-level firm. I was good at it, exceptionally good. My mind has always seen the world in patterns, in systems. I could look at a spreadsheet with 10,000 entries and spot the single flawed calculation like a hawk spotting a field mouse from 1,000 feet up. But my talent brought me no joy. It was a finely tuned engine running on fumes, powering a vehicle that was going nowhere I wanted to be. Every morning, I'd knot my tie and feel it tighten like a noose, a daily reminder of the life I was quietly suffocating in. The dream wasn't to be rich, not at first. The dream was to be free, free from the 8 a.m. commute, from the pointless meetings, from the condescending praise of my boss, a man named Henderson, whose only real skill was taking credit for my work. I wanted a life where my intelligence directly correlated with my success, not with how many quarterly reports I could churn out. I was a man starving for consequence, and my life had none. The catalyst for my transformation came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, hiding in the dusty corner of a second-hand bookstore. I found a worn paperback with a faded cover, Beat the Dealer by Edward O. Thorpe. It wasn't a book about gambling, it was a book about mathematics. It detailed with academic precision how a player could use a card-counting strategy to gain a statistical edge over the house in the game of blackjack. It wasn't about luck. It was about exploiting a fundamental flaw in the game's design. As I read, something in my brain ignited. The concepts of running counts, true counts, and bet spreads, it was all just accounting. It was tracking assets, high cards, and liabilities, low cards, to determine the profitability of the next move. The casino wasn't a dragon to be slain by a lucky knight. It was a business, and its blackjack tables had a vulnerability in their operating model. For the first time in years, I felt a surge of genuine excitement. The numbers on those pages weren't abstract figures. They were a blueprint for my escape. That night I bought 6 decks of playing cards. My quiet beige apartment became my laboratory. For the next year, my life was a secret duality. By day I was Arthur Vance, the reliable, boring accountant. But by night I was a machine in training. I'd sit at my kitchen table for hours, dealing cards, my lips moving silently as I kept the running count. +1, +2, 0, -1, -2. I learned to keep the count while the TV was blaring, while music was playing, while I was talking on the phone. I practiced converting the running count to a true count based on deck penetration, my mind performing the swift, silent division over and over again. I timed myself. I pushed myself to the point of exhaustion. My friends thought I'd become a recluse. They had no idea I was forging the key to my own prison cell. The most important rule, the one drilled into me by every book I read, was bankroll management. This was the holy grail. I took every dollar of my savings, $10,000 I had meticulously put away, and placed it in a separate bank account. This was my bankroll. It was a sacred tool, never to be touched for rent, for food, for anything other than the mission. I was to bet a tiny fraction of it, a specific percentage dictated by my statistical edge. This discipline, this firewall between my life and my work, was what separated a professional from a degenerate gambler. It was a lesson I would, decades later, fatally forget. My first real test wasn't in the glittering palaces of Las Vegas. It was in a dingy, smoke-filled casino on the outskirts of Reno, the kind of place where the carpets are sticky and the complimentary drinks are mostly sugar. I sat down at a $5 minimum table, my heart pounding against my ribs so hard I was sure the dealer could see my shirt vibrating. I was terrified. But the moment the cards started coming, the training took over. My mind went quiet, the noise of the casino faded away, and there were only the numbers. +1, 0, +1, +2. The count was high. My edge was significant. My strategy sheet, memorized to perfection, told me to double down on a hard 11 against a dealer's 10. My hands trembled as I pushed out the extra chips. The table groaned. An old man next to me muttered, "Bad move, kid." The dealer turned over her card, a face card. Bust. I won. The feeling wasn't the wild euphoria you see in movies. It was quiet, cold, and powerful. It was the feeling of confirmation. My system worked. That first night I walked out with a profit of $85. It felt more real and more earned than my entire monthly salary. This journey started in that small casino in Reno, a world away from the glamour most people imagine. And I know you're all watching this from every corner of the globe. So before I tell you how I turned $10,000 into $1 million, please subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. For 6 months, I repeated the process. Weekends were for driving to forgotten casinos in Nevada and Northern California. I was a ghost, never staying too long, never winning too much at any one place. My bankroll grew slowly, methodically. $10,000 became $15,000. $15,000 became $25,000. It was a grind. But then came the real test, the one that every system player must face, the losing streak. It happened over a 3-day weekend. For 3 days, variance, the fancy word for bad luck, was against me. Every decision my system told me to make, every time I increased my bet into a high count, I lost. The dealer would pull a 21. The player before me would take the card I needed. It was a statistical anomaly, a brutal, relentless storm of bad fortune. I lost nearly 40% of my bankroll. My mind, the logical accounting part of my brain, was screaming at me. It felt wrong. It felt like I was hemorrhaging money. The temptation to abandon the system, to just walk away, or, even worse, to make a huge, emotional bet to win it all back was overwhelming. I was down to my last few $1,000s for the trip. The count on a 6-deck shoe shot up to a true count of +5, a rare and incredibly advantageous situation. The system was clear. Bet the maximum. My entire body screamed no. My hands were slick with sweat. I felt sick. But this was the moment. Was I a professional who trusted the math, or just another gambler ruled by fear? I pushed a mountain of chips, a bet larger than any I had ever made, into the circle. The table went silent. The old man from my first night seemed to be there again, shaking his head in spirit. I had an 18. The dealer was showing a 6. The book says to stand. I held my breath. She flipped her card. A 10. She had 16. She had to hit. The next card she drew was a 7. Bust. The wave of relief was so intense my knees felt weak. The tide had turned. For the rest of the night, the cards fell my way. I not only won back everything I had lost, but I walked away with the biggest profit of my career up to that point. That night was the true beginning. It wasn't about the money I won. It was about the discipline I had shown. I had faced the storm and hadn't wavered. I had proven to myself that I could control my emotions and trust the numbers, no matter what. The following Monday, I walked into Henderson's office. I didn't say a word. I just placed my letter of resignation on his desk. It was 2 sentences long. He looked at me, bewildered. "Are you going to a competitor, Arthur? I hope you know what you're doing." I just smiled. "Oh, I do," I said. "For the first time in my life, I really do. I moved to Las Vegas. I treated it like a business. I played from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. with a 1-hour lunch break. I rotated between 3 different casinos to keep my face from getting too familiar. I never drank alcohol while I played. I never spoke to the other players. I was a focused, relentless money-making machine. The climb was meteoric. My bankroll crossed the $100,000 mark. Then $250,000. The dealers knew me. The pit bosses watched me, their eyes a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect. They knew I was counting, but since it wasn't illegal, all they could do was back me off, politely tell me my business was no longer welcome. Getting backed off became a badge of honor. It meant I was winning. It meant I was a threat. The day my net worth crossed $1 million, I didn't celebrate with champagne or a wild party. I went back to my hotel room, ordered a steak from room service, and looked out the window at the glittering lights of the Las Vegas Strip. I hadn't gotten lucky. I had earned this. I had outsmarted a system designed to crush people. I was 31 years old, a millionaire, and completely free. I was on top of the world, a master of my own universe, the man who had tamed chance itself. I felt truly, completely, and dangerously invincible. I had the world at my feet, and my only job was to count to 21. Little did I know the most dangerous numbers were still yet to come. The 5 years that followed my move to Las Vegas were less a life and more a sustained coronation. The man who had once been backed off from $10 tables was now the kind of player casinos chartered private jets to acquire. The dynamic had inverted completely. I was no longer the predator stalking the herd. I was the prized lion they lured into a golden cage, hoping to profit from the spectacle of my presence. They would offer me loss rebates, appearance fees, and suites so opulent they made palaces look quaint, all under the veiled assumption that eventually every system fails and every genius gets bored and makes a mistake. For a long time, I proved them wrong. I took their jets, slept in their suites, drank their finest scotch, always after my session, and systematically relieved their tables of 6 figures a month. My home was a penthouse on the 57th floor of a new residential tower, a glass box in the sky with a panoramic, godlike view of the entire Las Vegas Strip. From that height, the city's chaotic, desperate energy was rendered silent and beautiful, a river of light that flowed for my personal amusement. I had the floors redone in Italian marble, not because I particularly liked marble, but because I could. I commissioned a kinetic sculpture for my living room that used magnets to suspend a series of silver spheres in a perpetual hypnotic dance. It cost more than my parents' first house. It did nothing. It was the physical manifestation of my success, expensive, complex, and utterly pointless. The accountant in me hadn't died. He had simply become the manager of an absurdly profitable single-shareholder corporation. Me. My wealth wasn't a pile of cash. It was a portfolio. I had investments, real estate holdings, and a team of wealth managers who spoke in hushed, reverent tones. But my heart was still in the game. The core of my fortune still came from the felt. By the time I was 35, my net worth was north of $50 million. The money had become an abstraction, a scorecard. The true currency I dealt in was power. Power was walking into the Bellagio and having the casino host, a man who managed the accounts of oil sheiks and tech billionaires, greet me by my first name and personally escort me to my private table. Power was the almost imperceptible flicker of fear in a pit boss's eyes when I sat down. They knew my reputation. I wasn't a gambler. I was a statistical certainty, an actuary of their downfall. This new life transformed me. The quiet, focused man who practiced for a year in his lonely apartment was gone. In his place was Arthur Vance, a persona I wore like one of my custom-tailored suits. This Arthur was confident, aloof, and exuded an aura of untouchable intelligence. He didn't smile much. He spoke in quiet, measured tones. He cultivated an air of mystery. The truth was, this persona was a fortress I built to protect the core of my system. If they thought I was some kind of savant, a mathematical freak of nature, they wouldn't look for the simple, grinding discipline at the heart of it all. The myth was more profitable than the man. The problem with reaching the summit of a mountain is that there's nowhere else to go but down, and the air is thin up there. My disciplined 10 to 6 schedule began to fray. Sometimes I wouldn't start playing until the evening. Blackjack, the intricate puzzle that had once consumed my every waking thought, the very engine of my liberation, had become a chore. The magic was gone. I'd sit at the table, my mind effortlessly tracking the count, my hands moving on autopilot, and I would feel nothing. The thrill of the intellectual chase was over. I had solved the maze, and now I was just walking the same predictable path over and over again. The wins didn't excite me, and the occasional session loss was nothing more than a minor business expense, an expected deviation. I was a master craftsman, forced to build the same simple chair every single day. The work was easy, the pay was phenomenal, but my soul was beginning to atrophy from the sheer mind-numbing repetition. That's when the first crack started to appear in the foundation of my discipline. It began with an insatiable restlessness. After my sessions, I'd wander the casino floor, not as a professional, but as a voyeur. I was drawn to the sounds I had trained myself to ignore, the jubilant roar from a craps table as a shooter hit their point, the collective gasp at a roulette wheel as the ball danced over the frets, the boisterous laughter from a poker game. These games were everything my world was not. They were chaotic, emotional, and visceral. They were ruled by raw, naked chance. I remember one night with perfect clarity. I had just finished a session up a tidy $40,000. It felt as satisfying as filing a tax return correctly. As I walked past a craps table, a wave of energy, a palpable thing, hit me. A woman with big hair and a sequined dress was on a hot streak, rolling the dice with theatrical flair. The whole table was alive, a community bound by shared hope and superstition. Men in suits were high-fiving guys in torn jeans. It was messy. It was human. It was everything my sterile, silent blackjack table wasn't. On a whim, a dangerous alien impulse, I stepped up to the table. The old Arthur, the accountant, was screaming a silent litany of warnings in my head. This is a negative expectation game. The house edge is immutable. This is career suicide, but the new Arthur, the bored king in his castle, simply wanted to feel something. I pulled a $1,000 chip from my pocket, what I mentally categorized as entertainment expense, and placed it on the pass line. It was an act of rebellion against the very philosophy that had built my empire. The woman rolled the dice. A 7. The table erupted. The dealer pushed a matching black chip towards me. I let it ride. She rolled again. An 11. Another win. In less than a minute, I had made $2,000 with zero thought, zero skill, and zero effort. I picked up my winnings and walked away, but something inside me had shifted. The clean, sterile firewall between my professional bankroll and fun money had been breached. I had played a game of chance and been rewarded. It was a tiny crack, but it was there. A few weeks later, the crack widened. I was waiting for my car at the valet after a particularly tedious session. I could hear the familiar clatter of the roulette wheel from the high-limit salon. I wandered in. The game has always been the most seductive of all casino offerings, a triumph of elegant design and brutal mathematics. The wheel is a perfect circle of possibilities, hypnotic and fair in its randomness. It's also a financial graveyard. The house edge is a monstrous 5.26% on an American wheel. Playing it is the statistical equivalent of setting fire to a nickel out of every dollar you bet. I watched for a while, nursing a glass of water. A group of wealthy tourists were throwing chips around, betting on birthdays and anniversaries. It was amateurish, foolish, and they were having the time of their lives. I felt a strange mix of contempt and envy. Then I had a thought, insidious and compelling. My birthday was coming up, number 23. What if? The thought was so absurd, so contrary to my entire being, that I almost laughed out loud. Betting on a single number is the purest form of gambling, a prayer offered to the gods of chaos. But the boredom, the deep, aching ennui of my perfect life, pushed me forward. I approached the table. The minimum bet was $100. I pulled out 10 $1,000 chips. I wasn't going to just bet on my birthday. I was going to make a statement. I placed the entire $10,000 stack neatly on number 23. The dealer, a man I recognized from my blackjack rounds, raised an eyebrow. The tourists fell silent, their small-time bets dwarfed by my monument to recklessness. The pit boss started walking over, a concerned look on his face. He probably thought I was drunk or distraught. He had no idea I was just terminally bored. "No more bets," the dealer announced, his voice flat. He spun the wheel, and the little white ball began its frantic, rattling journey. The 30 seconds it took for that ball to lose momentum felt longer than my entire first year of training. Every eye was on the wheel. My heart, for the first time in years, was pounding. I wasn't calculating odds, I was just hoping. The ball skipped, bounced and teetered. It flirted with the black 10, danced over the red 30, and then, with a final decisive click, it settled into the red pocket of number 23. A collective gasp went through the salon. The dealer's professional veneer cracked for a moment. He looked at the wheel, then at me. He began to count out the chips. A single number bet pays 35 to 1. My $10,000 had just become $350,000, plus my original bet back, in 30 seconds. The feeling was nothing like the quiet satisfaction of a successful card-counting session. This was a lightning strike. It was a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. It was euphoric, electric, and utterly terrifying. The tourists were clapping. The pit boss was forcing a smile, congratulating me while likely having a heart attack internally. I just nodded, collected the mountain of chips, gave the dealer a $5,000 tip, and walked out without another word, my legs feeling unsteady. As the valet pulled my Aston Martin around, I stood on the curb, the cool desert air doing nothing to calm the fire in my veins. The old Arthur was in a state of shock. He was trying to tell me that this was a 1 in 38 statistical fluke, a dangerous outlier that meant nothing. He was screaming that I had been rewarded for doing something incredibly stupid, and that was the most dangerous outcome of all. But the new Arthur, the king, the myth, was telling me a different story. He whispered that maybe the system I had mastered was just the first level of the game. That maybe after a certain point a man like me transcends the math. I had won more in one spin of a wheel, based on a sentimental whim, than I often made in a week of grinding, meticulous work. And the lesson I took from that night, the poison that seeped into the cracks of my soul, was the most destructive one imaginable. Perhaps discipline wasn't the whole story. Perhaps I wasn't just smart. Perhaps I was also lucky. I broke my most fundamental rule: never play a game you can't beat, and the universe had rewarded me with a fortune. It was the beginning of the end, and in my arrogance, I mistook it for a brand new beginning. That win at the roulette table was a deep and resonant poison. It didn't just give me a thrill, it retroactively rewrote my own history. My origin story was no longer about a methodical accountant escaping a beige life through discipline. It was now the legend of a man blessed by the gods of mathematics and fortune, a man for whom all rules, even those of probability, would eventually bend. This new narrative was far more seductive and infinitely more dangerous. The accountant in me was being shoved into a dark corner of my mind by a flamboyant, risk-addicted emperor, and the emperor was winning. It was during this period of quiet internal decay that I met Sarah. I met her in a place as far removed from the casino floor as one could get, an art gallery downtown, in a district that was trying to cultivate a soul amidst the neon desert. I was there to acquire an asset, a large minimalist painting of stark white lines on a black canvas that my interior designer assured me would complete the aesthetic of my penthouse. I was about to write the check, treating the transaction with all the passion of buying treasury bonds, when a woman with fiery red hair and eyes the color of sea glass approached me. "You don't actually like it, do you?" she said. It wasn't an accusation, just a simple, direct observation. I was taken aback. People in my orbit didn't question me. They agreed, they flattered, they facilitated. "I'm not sure like is the operative word," I replied coolly. "It's a significant piece by a notable artist. It's a sound investment." She smiled, a small, knowing expression that both irritated and intrigued me. "That's what you say when you buy a stock, not a piece of art. Art is supposed to make you feel something. That piece," she gestured to the canvas, "is about the tension between order and chaos. The artist is showing how even in the most rigid structure, there's an inherent void. It's technically brilliant, but it's emotionally sterile." She looked me right in the eye. "Is that what you want on your wall? A beautiful, empty equation?" No one had spoken to me like that in years. She wasn't impressed by my watch or the quiet deference the gallery owner was showing me. She was engaging with my mind, challenging my premise. We ended up talking for 2 hours, ignoring the painting completely. Her name was Sarah Kendricks, and she owned the gallery. She spoke about art the way I used to speak about numbers, with a fiery passion for the underlying structure, the hidden language. She saw the world in color, texture, and emotion. I saw it in probabilities and expected value. Yet we found a strange, compelling common ground. For the first time in a long time, I felt like Arthur, the man, not Arthur Vance, the myth. Our relationship was an oasis of normalcy in my increasingly bizarre life. With her, I wasn't the king of Vegas. We would drive out to Red Rock Canyon and hike for hours, the silence of the desert a welcome antidote to the constant chime of slot machines. She took me to hole-in-the-wall restaurants, introduced me to jazz musicians and poets. She was grounding me, reminding me that a world existed beyond the felt tables and the penthouse views. She fell in love with the brilliant, focused mind she saw glimpses of, the man who had meticulously forged his own freedom. The problem was, that man was slowly being assassinated by his own success. She saw the cracks long before I did. After the roulette win, my behavior changed. I grew impatient with the slow, steady grind of blackjack. The adrenaline rush from that single lucky spin had rewired my brain. I needed a stronger dose. I found it in high-stakes poker. Poker was a different beast entirely. Blackjack was a monologue with the dealer. Poker was a multifaceted war of psychology. It involved math, but it was also about deception, courage, and the ability to read the souls of the men sitting across from you. My ego, now bloated and ravenous, convinced me this was the next logical conquest. Having mastered the cold calculus of cards, I would now master the chaotic art of men. I started frequenting the private, big-money cash games that ran in the back rooms of the city's most exclusive establishments. These weren't the sanitized, televised tournaments. This was a blood sport. The silence in these rooms was heavier, the money was older, and the players were sharks who had been navigating these waters their entire lives. At first, my reputation preceded me. They were wary of the blackjack genius. My disciplined image served me well, and I had some initial success against the weaker players, but the true professionals, the men with ice in their veins, they saw right through me. They identified my weakness with predatory precision. I was playing the cards, not the players. I was trying to solve them like an equation, but they were irrational, emotional, and cunning. My greatest flaw was my arrogance. I couldn't conceive that a man who ran a chain of used car dealerships could possibly outthink me. But he could. He could read the subtle tension in my jaw, the way I stacked my chips, the almost imperceptible flicker in my eye when I was bluffing. He wasn't playing the odds, he was playing me. One night I lost over $500,000 in a single poker game. A brutal, gut-wrenching session where every bluff I ran was caught, and every strong hand I held was crushed by an even stronger one. I walked out of that room feeling something I hadn't felt since my first day in Reno. Fear. And something new. Shame. I had been intellectually dismantled. When I got back to the penthouse at 4 a.m., Sarah was awake, reading on the couch. She looked at me and she knew. She didn't have to ask. "It's just a downswing," I lied, the words tasting like ash. Variance. It happens. It was the first time I had ever lied to her about my work. My entire life had been built on a foundation of unshakable rules, and I was now breaking them, one by one. I was no longer a professional managing risk. I was a gambler hiding his losses. I covered the $500,000 deficit by liquidating some stocks, keeping my sacred casino bankroll artificially pristine. It was an accounting trick, a fraud perpetrated against myself and the woman I loved. The losses in poker made me desperate to reaffirm my own genius. I needed a win so monumental it would silence the growing whispers of doubt in my own mind. That's when the invitation arrived. It wasn't an email or a phone call from a casino host. It was a single, thick piece of black cardstock delivered by a silent courier. On it, embossed in gold leaf, was a stylized V and an address for a private villa in the hills overlooking the city. Below it, a date and a time. No other details. I knew instantly what it was. It was an invitation to the game known only in hushed whispers as the Elysian Table. It was hosted by a man named Dmitry Volkov, a shadowy Russian industrialist who owned assets across the globe but maintained his favorite residence in Vegas. He was a myth himself, a man who treated money with a contempt that only those with an infinite supply of it could afford. His game was legendary for two reasons. The stakes were astronomical, often reaching 8 figures in a single night, and it was exclusively baccarat. Baccarat, the most elegant and mindless game in the casino. A game with no strategy to speak of. You bet on the player or you bet on the banker. That's it, it's a coin flip in a tuxedo. For a man like me, playing baccarat was intellectual sacrilege. It was a complete and utter surrender to pure, unadulterated chance. To accept the invitation was to renounce everything I had ever built my life on. My logical mind, the accountant who was still alive in that dark corner, screamed that this was a gilded trap, an executioner's ball. But the emperor, the myth-maker, the man who had been blessed by the roulette wheel, saw it differently. He saw it as the ultimate affirmation. To win at a game of pure luck would be the final proof that he was, in fact, transcendent. It was an opportunity to vanquish the ghosts of the poker room and reclaim his throne as the king of Vegas. The internal battle was brief and brutal. My ego didn't just win, it annihilated my reason. I hid the invitation from Sarah, but a few nights before the game she found it in my desk drawer while looking for a pen. I came home to find her sitting on the sofa, the black card resting on the coffee table between us. The air in the room was cold and heavy. "What is this, Arthur?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. I tried to be dismissive. "It's just an invitation, a bit of fun. You wouldn't understand the people involved." "Oh, I think I do," she said, her sea-glass eyes fixing on me. "They're men like you, men with holes in their souls so big you could fly a private jet through them." She stood up and walked to the vast window, looking down at the river of lights. "When I met you, you told me you didn't gamble. You said you had a system, that you were an investor who went to an office made of green felt. I believed you. But you're not that man anymore. That man wouldn't be playing poker until dawn, and he certainly wouldn't be entertaining this death wish. It's the biggest game in the world, Sarah. It's a sign of respect that I was even invited," I argued, my voice rising. I needed her to see it as an achievement, not a symptom of disease. She turned back to face me, and her expression was one of profound sadness and clarity. "No, it's a test. And it's not about the money, is it? You have more money than you could ever spend. This is about that hole. You keep trying to fill it with more chips, more risk, more proof that you're special. But it never gets smaller, does it? It only gets bigger." She walked over to me and put a hand on my cheek. Her touch was cool. "Don't go, Arthur. Please. For us. Let's leave this city. We can go anywhere. We have enough. You are enough." It was an ultimatum delivered with love and desperation. She was offering me a lifeline, a path back to sanity, back to the man she fell in love with, and for a fleeting, beautiful moment, I wanted to take it. I could see the life she was describing, a quiet, real existence filled with art, travel, and peace. But then I looked past her, at the reflection in the window. I saw myself, surrounded by the trappings of my empire, and I heard the siren song of the game. The need to prove her wrong, to prove to myself that I was the master of my own destiny, that I could walk into the heart of chaos and bend it to my will, was an addiction more powerful than any drug. I gently removed her hand from my face. "It's only one night," I said softly, the ultimate lie. "I need to do this. I need to prove that I can beat them at their own game." Her eyes welled up, but she didn't let the tears fall. The hope in her expression died, replaced by a devastating certainty. "When you lose everything," she whispered, her voice cracking, "that promise will be the only thing you have left." She turned and walked towards the bedroom, her movements graceful and final. I stood there in the cavernous, silent living room, the city lights glittering below like a pile of scattered jewels. I didn't go after her. I didn't call her name. Instead, I walked over to my desk, picked up my phone and dialed the number for the RSVP. A man with a thick Eastern European accent answered on the first ring. "Vance," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil within. "I'll be there." I had made my choice. I had chosen the myth over the woman, the abyss over the oasis. I hung up the phone, and in the profound silence that followed, I could feel the last vestiges of the old Arthur, the careful accountant from the beige cubicle, finally and irrevocably dying. The night of the game, I left Sarah a note. It was a coward's gesture, filled with hollow promises about our future and justifications for my actions. I wrote that this was the last time, a final chapter before we began a new life. As I sealed the envelope, I felt a pang of self-loathing so sharp it almost bent me in two. I was already a liar, and the first hand had not even been dealt. I chose a suit of midnight blue, a tie of silver silk, and a Hublot watch that felt heavier than an anchor on my wrist. I was dressing for my own execution, cloaking myself in the armor of my success, hoping it would be thick enough to survive the night. The address led me to a sprawling modernist villa carved into the side of the hills, far from the incandescent glow of the Strip. There were no flashing signs here, only the quiet authority of old money and absolute power. The door was opened by a man who looked like he could snap a spine without changing his expression. He led me through a hallway that felt more like a modern art museum than a home, the walls lined with canvases that I, thanks to Sarah's tutelage, recognized as being priceless. The air was cool and still, scented with the faint, expensive aroma of cedarwood and cigar smoke. The game was being held in a room that opened onto an infinity pool, the water a sheet of black glass that reflected the distant, shimmering city below. There were only 4 other players seated at the large oval baccarat table, and my host, Dmitry Volkov, who sat not as a player, but as an overseer at the head of the table. He was a man of indeterminate age, with pale, watchful eyes, and a stillness that was deeply unnerving. He didn't exude power. He was simply its center of gravity. He nodded at me as I took my seat, a gesture that was neither warm nor unwelcoming, merely an acknowledgement of my arrival. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Welcome. We trust your journey was pleasant." I simply nodded back. The other players were a collection of global titans, a Hong Kong shipping magnate, a Brazilian mining baron, an old-money European aristocrat, and a young tech billionaire from Silicon Valley who looked painfully out of place in his designer hoodie. There was no friendly chatter, no bravado. The atmosphere was thick with a tension that was almost suffocating. This wasn't a game. It was a transaction of egos, a silent, brutal audit of nerve and fortune. The buy-in, I had been informed, was $2 million. I had the cashier's check in my pocket, representing a significant but, I told myself, manageable portion of my liquid assets. I exchanged it for a neat rack of large, unmarked chips that felt cold and heavy, like tombstones. The dealer was a consummate professional, her hands moving with the fluid, impersonal grace of a surgeon. Baccarat is a game of beautiful simplicity and horrifying speed. 2 hands are dealt, the player and the banker. You bet on which one will be closer to a total of 9. That's it. There are no decisions to make after your bet, no strategy to employ. You place your chips and you become a spectator to your own fate. It is the purest, most undiluted form of gambling, a perfect mirror for the soul of the person playing. For the first few hands, I watched. I tried to find a pattern, a bias in the shoe, a tell from the dealer. The accountant in me was desperately searching for a system to apply, a problem to solve. But there was nothing. It was just chaos in a velvet box. The Brazilian lost $500,000 on the first hand and didn't even flinch. Finally, I began to play. I started with a small bet on the banker, the statistically slightly better option. I won. Then another. I was up $100,000 in 5 minutes. A small familiar voice in my head told me to stand up right now, to walk away with a profit, and the knowledge that I had attended the great Elysian table and won. It was the last rational thought I would have all night. The emperor, the myth, laughed it into silence. Winning a pittance wasn't the point. Dominance was. I began to increase my wagers, and then the tide turned. The shoe went cold. Every bet I made was wrong. If I bet on banker, player would draw a perfect 8. If I switched to player, banker would reveal a natural 9. The rhythm of the game was merciless. A hand took less than a minute. My neat stacks of chips began to erode, sliding across the felt to the other side of the table like iron filings drawn to a powerful magnet. With each loss, a little piece of my composure chipped away. The aloof, untouchable persona I had cultivated for years began to crack. My $2 million buy-in was cut in half. Then, by 3/4. The accountant was screaming now, a frantic, panicked voice pleading with me to stop, to cut my losses, to remember the first rule of bankroll management. I ignored him. The emperor was wounded, his pride bleeding out on the table. He demanded satisfaction. He demanded to be proven right. I started chasing my losses, doubling my bets in a desperate attempt to get back to even. This wasn't a strategy. It was the gambler's death spiral, the most basic and fatal error in the book. I put my remaining $500,000 on a single hand. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. My palms were slick with sweat. The dealer slid out the cards. I had bet on player. The player hand was a king and a 6, for a total of 6, a strong hand. The banker hand was revealed, a 4 and a 2, also a 6, a tie, a push. My bet was returned to me. There was no relief in that moment, only a surge of frustrated rage. I needed a resolution, a win or a loss. The suspense was unbearable. Without thinking, I pushed the $500,000 stack back onto the player spot and added the rest of my chips to it. Everything I had, all 2 million, one hand. The Brazilian mining baron raised an eyebrow slightly. It was the first sign of emotion I'd seen from anyone. Volkov just watched, his pale eyes unblinking. The dealer burned a card and dealt again. The sequence is a blur in my memory, a nightmare kaleidoscope of colors and numbers. But the result is etched into my soul. The player hand had a 3. The banker hand had a 7. I lost. Just like that. In the space of about 2 hours, $2 million had vanished. The sound in the room didn't change. The game simply continued around me, my empty spot on the felt, a silent testament to my failure. Humiliation washed over me, hot and suffocating. I had come to this table to cement my legend and had been dismissed like an amateur. The myth of Arthur Vance had died right here in this silent, opulent room. All that was left was the man, and the man was a fool. I prepared to stand, to make the long, shameful walk of the loser out of the villa, and back to a life where I would have to face not only Sarah, but the shattered reflection of myself. But as I pushed my chair back, Dmitry Volkov spoke, his voice cutting through the quiet clinking of the chips. "Leaving so soon, Mr. Vance?" I looked at him. "My business here is concluded," I said, my voice tight. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible smile. "Nonsense, the night is young. Your presence adds a certain intellectual rigor to the proceedings. It would be a shame to lose it over a temporary logistical issue." He motioned to the silent man standing by the door. The man approached the table and placed a small leather-bound checkbook and a gold pen in front of me. "A line of credit, of course," Volkov said, as if offering me a glass of water. "Let us say $1 million to start. On the house. A marker. Your reputation is more than sufficient collateral." The air left my lungs. The offer hung in the silent room, shimmering with temptation and poison. Every rule I had ever lived by, every principle that had formed the bedrock of my success, screamed in unison, "No! Never play with money you don't have. Never play on credit. This is the final, irrevocable line between a professional and a degenerate. This is the abyss." Walking away now meant public humiliation in front of these men, but it also meant survival. I would be wounded, my ego shattered, but I would be financially intact. I would still be a millionaire who had a very bad night. But to accept was to admit that the money was more important than the principle. It was to admit that my addiction to the game was more powerful than my discipline. It was to willingly place a noose around my own neck, simply for the chance to stay at the execution a little longer. I looked at Volkov. In his pale, knowing eyes, I saw that he understood this perfectly. He wasn't offering me a lifeline. He was offering me a shovel, knowing full well I would use it to dig my own grave. He had read me not as a mathematician, but as a man whose ego was in its death throes, and he knew a dying ego would do anything for one more breath, one more chance at redemption. He had set the perfect trap. Everyone at the table was watching me. The silence was absolute, heavier than any sound. I thought of Sarah's face, her warning echoing in my memory. When you lose everything, that promise will be the only thing you have left. I had promised her it was only one night. Here was my chance to keep that promise, to end it. Then I looked at the mocking emptiness of the felt in front of me and the mountain of chips beside the Brazilian baron. The humiliation burned away all reason. The emperor wasn't dead yet, and he would not be dismissed. My hand moved, seemingly of its own volition. I picked up the heavy gold pen. The metal was cold against my skin. In that moment, staring at the blank line on the marker, I wasn't just signing for $1 million loan. I was signing my confession. I was signing away the last remnants of the disciplined professional I once was. I was signing my sentence of ruin. I put the pen to the paper and wrote my name. The moment the ink from the gold pen touched the paper, a profound and irreversible shift occurred within me. The internal war that had raged for months was finally over. The disciplined accountant, the cautious strategist, the man who built an empire on the bedrock of logic. He wasn't just silenced, he was annihilated. In his place stood something raw and primal, a gambler, pure and simple. The $1 million marker wasn't a loan, it was a liberation. It freed me from the final shackles of my own rules. All the discipline I had cultivated over a decade evaporated in that single damning signature, replaced by a terrifying, exhilarating nihilism. If I was going to burn, I decided in that instant, I would burn so brightly the entire city would see the flames. $1 million, I said to the dealer, my voice a strange, hollow echo of its former self. Banker. The entire sum, the entirety of Volkov's poisoned gift, on a single hand. The tech billionaire who had been methodically playing for 100,000 a hand physically recoiled. Dmitry Volkov, however, merely inclined his head, a faint glimmer of what might have been amusement in his pale eyes. He was like a biologist observing a specimen's predictable, self-destructive behavior in a petri dish. The cards were dealt. I don't remember them. I only remember the outcome. I won. A mountain of chips worth $2 million was pushed toward me. There was no elation, no sense of victory. There was only a ravenous hunger for more. I was no longer trying to get back to even. I was trying to obliterate the table, to inflict a wound on the universe as deep as the one that had been inflicted on my pride. I left the entire $2 million on the banker. I won again. Now I had $4 million. The Brazilian baron, who had been quietly accumulating a fortune, stopped playing to watch me. I had become the spectacle. I was the falling star they had all gathered to see. I pushed the $4 million. I lost. The swing was violent, nauseating. $4 million gone in under a minute. The nihilistic euphoria curdled into a cold, hard knot of panic in my stomach. But I couldn't stop. I was no longer in control. I was a passenger in my own body, driven by an engine of pure compulsion. I looked at Volkov. He simply gestured to the leather-bound checkbook. I signed another marker, this time for $2 million, then another, and another. The night dissolved into a fever dream, a surreal montage of elegantly turned cards, the soft whisper of chips on felt, and the scratch of a gold pen signing away my life. I lost all sense of the money's reality. The chips were no longer representatives of my penthouse, my cars, my portfolio. They were just abstract units in a desperate, unwinnable war against fate. I was playing with a recklessness that bordered on insanity. The other players had stopped betting against me, instead placing their wagers on the opposite side, riding the tidal wave of my destruction. I was single-handedly funding their victories. They were vultures, patiently circling as I bled out. At some point, the first rays of dawn began to creep over the distant mountains, painting the sky in sickly shades of orange and purple. The city lights below had faded, their magic extinguished by the harsh reality of the coming day. The game had been going on for nearly 8 hours. The only players left at the table were myself, the Brazilian baron, and Volkov, who continued to watch with the placid curiosity of a god. I had no idea how much I had signed away. I only knew that the number was catastrophic. Volkov's silent assistant approached and whispered something in his ear. Volkov held up a hand, and the dealer paused. "Mr. Vance," my host said, his voice still infuriatingly calm. "A tally, perhaps, before we conclude our evening's entertainment." The assistant placed a single sheet of paper in front of me. On it was a list of the markers I had signed. I stared at the number at the bottom of the page, but my brain refused to process it. It was an impossible figure, a string of zeros that looked like a mathematical error. $9,700,000. $9,700,000. The air solidified in my lungs. I felt a wave of vertigo so intense the room seemed to tilt on its axis. This number was not an abstraction. This was everything. This was more than my liquid wealth. This was the value of my entire constructed life. As you can see, Volkov continued smoothly, it has been a most eventful night. You have 300,000 remaining on your last marker, perhaps one final hand, for the sake of symmetry. Let us round the evening off to a pleasing 10 million. He said it with the casual air of a man suggesting dessert after a fine meal. It was the most brutal act of cruelty I have ever witnessed. He wasn't just taking my money. He was demanding a theatrically perfect and complete annihilation. My hands were trembling so violently I had to clench them into fists under the table. My mind was a blizzard of white noise. All I could see was Sarah's face, her sad, knowing eyes. When you lose everything, there was no choice. To refuse was to just delay the inevitable. With a hand that felt like it belonged to a stranger, I pushed my last $300,000 into the betting circle. It was a pathetic, almost comical sum compared to the debt I had accrued. The Brazilian, with a look that might have been pity, declined to bet. It was just me, against the house. The dealer, her face an unreadable mask, dealt the final cards of my life as a wealthy man. The ritual was the same, but the weight of this moment was crushing. She turned over the player's hand, a natural 8, the second best possible hand. A sliver of insane, irrational hope shot through me. Perhaps a miracle, perhaps a tie. She then revealed the banker's hand, a natural 9, the perfect hand. The game was over. A silence descended on the room, deeper and more profound than any that had come before. It was the silence of a tomb. I had lost. I had lost it all. The adrenaline, the rage, the desperation, it all drained out of me at once, leaving behind a hollow, cavernous emptiness. I felt nothing, just a vast, cold and infinite void. The walk out of that villa is a memory I often revisit in my nightmares. The sun was fully up now, its light harsh and unforgiving. The city below looked alien, a place I no longer belonged to. Volkov's silent guard escorted me to my car. He didn't say a word, but he didn't have to. The message was clear. You are no longer one of us. As I got into my Aston Martin, I knew it wasn't mine anymore. I was just borrowing it for one last ride. The days that followed were a systematic, dispassionate dismantling of my entire existence. Volkov's people were not thugs. They were worse. They were lawyers and accountants, men in sharp suits who moved with terrifying efficiency. I met them in a sterile boardroom. There was no negotiation. I was presented with a liquidation agreement. I signed over the deed to the penthouse, the titles to my 3 cars, and access to my entire investment portfolio. They drained my bank accounts, leaving me with only a few $1,000s in my checking account, a courtesy, their lawyer called it, to manage my transition. The process was surreal. One day a man came to my penthouse with a clipboard and began inventorying the art, my art, Sarah's world. He put a small sticker on the black and white painting that had started it all. Another man came to collect my watches. The Patek Philippe was gone, handed over as a down payment against the debt before I even left the villa. They took the rest, leaving only the cheap digital watch I kept in a gym bag. The phone calls began. Word travels fast in a city built on whispers. Business partners suddenly became unavailable. Friends I had known for years, men with whom I had shared expensive dinners and celebrated victories, stopped returning my calls. I was a pariah. My failure was a contagion they were terrified of catching. The power I had once wielded, the deference and respect I had commanded, had not been for me, Arthur Vance. It had been for my bank account. And now that the account was empty, I had ceased to exist. The final and most devastating loss was Sarah. I went to her gallery. I had rehearsed a speech, a desperate plea for forgiveness, but when I got there, a stark, white "For Lease" sign was plastered on the window. The space was empty, swept clean. I called her phone. It went straight to voicemail. Her mailbox was full. I went to her apartment. The doorman told me she had moved out a week ago, leaving no forwarding address. She had seen the coming storm and had gotten to high ground. She had saved herself. I couldn't blame her. I had made my choice that night, and I had chosen the abyss over her. The abyss had, in turn, swallowed me whole. Within 2 weeks, I was a ghost, haunting the ruins of my own life. I had gone from a king in a glass palace to a man with a single suitcase, a few $1,000s, and a cheap plastic watch. I found myself standing on a street corner, staring up at the 57th floor penthouse that was no longer mine. The lights were on. Someone else was living my life. I finally understood. I hadn't just lost my fortune. I had lost my identity. The myth, the legend, the blackjack genius. He had been a construct, a fragile thing built of money and ego. And when the money was gone, he simply vanished into thin air. All that was left was Arthur, a man I hadn't spoken to in over a decade, a man I didn't know at all, and he was standing on a street corner, utterly and completely alone, at the absolute bottom of the world. There is a particular kind of rock bottom that is reserved for those who fall from a great height. It's not a gentle slope, it's a sheer 100-story drop onto jagged stone. My landing was in the back of a 24-hour diner just off the interstate, a place that smelled perpetually of stale coffee and fried onions. My new job title was dishwasher. My kingdom was a steamy, chaotic corner of the kitchen where the clatter of plates was a constant, deafening roar. The first few weeks were a special kind of hell. My body, accustomed to the soft leather of casino chairs and the comfort of a penthouse, rebelled. My back ached with a fire I had never known. My hands, which had once so deftly handled $100,000 chips, became raw and blistered from the scalding water and industrial-grade soap. For 10 hours a day, I was an automaton, scraping other people's leftover food into a garbage disposal, my mind a blank slate of humiliation. I, Arthur Vance, the man who had cracked the code of chance, who had dined with billionaires, was now scrubbing dried egg yolk off a plate for minimum wage. The irony was so profound, so crushingly absolute, that it almost became a kind of dark, silent comedy. In those early days, shame was my only companion. I'd take my breaks in the alley, avoiding the eyes of the cooks and waitresses. I didn't want to talk to anyone, I didn't want to be known. I was a king in exile, convinced that every stranger who glanced at me could see the ghost of the man I used to be. The physical exhaustion was a mercy. It was the only thing that allowed me to sleep, to escape the relentless playback of that final night at Volkov's table, a horror film that looped endlessly in my head. But then, slowly, imperceptibly at first, something began to change. The work, in its brutal simplicity, started to have an unintended effect. For the first time in 15 years, my mind was quiet. It wasn't occupied with calculating probabilities, tracking card counts, or managing a multi-million-dollar portfolio. It was focused on a single, tangible task, getting the damn plates clean. There was a strange purity in it. A dirty plate went in, a clean plate came out. The result was immediate and undeniable. It was a kind of order I could impose on a small corner of a chaotic world. After a few months, I had saved enough to move out of the transient motel I'd been living in and into a small one-room apartment above a laundromat. The single window looked out onto a brick wall, but it was mine. I bought a cheap mattress, a hot plate, and a coffee maker. And in the quiet of that room, I began the slow, arduous process of meeting myself for the first time. The man I discovered was not the emperor I had pretended to be, nor was he the brilliant accountant who had started the journey. He was someone quieter, someone smaller. He found a strange contentment in things he hadn't noticed in decades. The taste of the first cup of coffee in the morning, the warmth of the sun on his face during his walk to work, the simple pleasure of reading a book from the public library, not for information or an edge, but just for the story. The constant gnawing pressure to perform, to win, to be more was gone, and in its absence there was not a void, but a sense of peace. It was a fragile, tentative peace, but it was real. The great epiphany didn't arrive like a lightning bolt. It seeped in gradually, like the morning light through my single window. I realized that my obsession had never truly been with money. The money was just the scorecard, the fuel. My real addiction was to the feeling of control. My card-counting system was my superpower. It gave me the illusion of control over the fundamentally uncontrollable force of chance. I wasn't a gambler, I was the opposite. I was a man so terrified of uncertainty that I dedicated my life to eliminating it. The money was just proof that my system worked, that I was smarter than chaos, that I was the master. That night at Volkov's table, I went there not to make money but to prove that my mastery was absolute, that it extended even to games of pure luck. When I lost, and then signed that first marker, I wasn't chasing my money. I was chasing that feeling of control that had slipped through my fingers. And in that desperate chase, I surrendered completely to the very chaos I had spent my life trying to conquer. Dmitry Volkov hadn't bankrupted me. My own hubris had. I had flown too close to the sun, not because I loved the heat, but because I believed its light emanated from me. I worked at that diner for 2 years. I was eventually promoted to line cook. I learned how to make a perfect omelette, how to manage the grill during the frantic Sunday morning rush. I made friends. They didn't know about my past and they didn't care. They knew me as Art, the quiet guy who was reliable and made a decent cup of coffee. My value to them had nothing to do with my net worth. It was based on my character, and for the first time I felt a kind of richness that my millions had never been able to buy. One day I decided it was time. I had spent years rebuilding my interior world. There was one final stone to turn over. I used the small savings I had accumulated to buy a bus ticket to Portland, Oregon. An old acquaintance had told me that Sarah had moved there and opened a new gallery. Finding it wasn't hard. It was a beautiful, light-filled space, more successful and vibrant than her old one. Through the window I saw her. She looked happy, truly happy. The sight of it didn't spark jealousy or regret, only a profound sense of relief. I almost turned away, but I knew I had to finish this. I took a deep breath and walked inside. She was talking to a client and didn't see me at first. When she did, her professional smile faltered for just a heartbeat. A flicker of a dozen emotions crossed her face: surprise, pain, caution, and then something like peace. "Arthur," she said, her voice soft. "Hello, Sarah," I replied. "The gallery is beautiful, more beautiful than the last one." She finished with her client and walked over to me. We stood in a comfortable silence for a moment, two survivors of a shipwreck meeting on a distant shore. "I'm not here to ask for anything," I said quickly. "I'm not here to apologize for the money or the penthouse. That was all just stuff. I'm here to apologize for that last night, for not listening, for choosing the noise over the quiet. You offered me a lifeline, and I let go. That was my greatest loss, not the $10 million. You." She looked at me, her sea-glass eyes searching my face. I imagined she saw the changes, the lines etched by hardship, the absence of arrogance. "I heard what happened," she said. "I was sorry, Arthur. Not for the money. I was sorry for you." "I know," I said. "It took me a long time to understand what you were trying to save me from. It wasn't financial ruin, it was myself." She gave me a small, genuine smile. "It looks like you finally managed to do it on your own." We talked for a little while longer. She was married now to a landscape architect. They had a daughter. My heart felt a pang, but it was a clean pain, one of consequence, not of bitterness. I was genuinely happy for her. She had built a life of real value, a life based on creation and love, while I had been building a castle of cards. Before I left, I looked at a small painting on the wall, a chaotic swirl of blues and greens, but with a single, calm point of white at its center. "That one," I said. "It feels like peace in the middle of a storm." She looked at the painting, then back at me. "It's called Sanctuary," she said. We said our goodbyes, not as former lovers, but as two people who had shared a significant piece of history and had both, in our own ways, survived it. As I walked out of her gallery and back into the sunlight, I felt the last, heavy chain of my past fall away. I was finally free. I'm 62 now. I work as a part-time bookkeeper for a few small businesses. It's quiet work, it's beige work, but it's honest. I live in a simple apartment. I have friends. I read. I walk. My life is small and it is peaceful. Sometimes I see tourists boarding buses to the casinos, their faces flush with hope and greed, and I feel a pang of something like pity. They think they're chasing a jackpot, but they're really just running from themselves. I spent a decade of my life mastering a system to beat the casino, but I lost spectacularly to the man in the mirror. I lost $10 million in a single catastrophic night, but in the ensuing silence in the wreckage, I found something I had never even known I was missing: myself. The hardest and most valuable lesson is this: the greatest wager you will ever make is not with your money. It's with your soul. The house doesn't always win, but pride wins every single time. If this story resonated with you, I ask you to please share it with someone who might need to hear this message. And finally, I'd like you to comment below with the most important lesson that life or money has ever taught you. Thank you for listening.